Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Cochrane Centre's Winter 2010 Research Webinar Series. My name is Adrienne Stevens, and I'm the Education Coordinator for the Center. How is everyone doing today? If you could just send me a happy face through the window if you're having a good day, if you have great weather out there. Oh, how wonderful. Things are just beautiful here in the nation's capital. It feels like spring is just around the corner. I just want to take a moment to thank the funding agencies of the Canadian Cochrane Network and Centre, those being the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and 6 of their research institutes. And as well, I would like to thank GRADEpro for their support during this funding period. As well, I would like to give special recognition to the Research Promotion and Development Division of the Pan American Health Organization. That is the regional office of the WHO for the Americas, for their provision of Illuminate Live to us here at the Cochrane Centre to be able to conduct these webinars. Thank you to PAHO, a value partner of the Canadian Cochrane Centre. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Nancy Santesso. She had conducted the webinar in December on the introduction to grade and summary findings tables, and now she's back to do a live demonstration of the GRADEpro software. Nancy is a registered dietitian as well as has a Master of Library and Information Science. She is presently in Hamilton at McMaster University working with Dr. Holger Schoenemann. She is a member of the Applicability and Recommendations Methods Group of the Cochrane Collaboration and provides support to people creating summary of findings tables for Cochrane systematic reviews. She has been involved in the development of guidelines for the WHO and other professional organizations using the GRADE approach. She is also an editor of the Consumers and Communication Review Group and is working to develop a format for and standardize plain language summaries in Cochrane reviews. So please join me in welcoming Nancy here today.
Thanks, Adrienne. And I just have a few slides at the beginning of the presentation, and then we'll go right into working on the software. So I'll just get started. And we'll have definitely a live demonstration of the software, but also I'll try and make sure to remember to stop so that people can ask questions. If I haven't left a period of time, or if you have a question that's pretty pertinent to that point in the presentation, please feel free to use the chat, or as Adrienne described, just put up your hand, and I'll make sure that I'll try and make sure that I keep track of that, and also Adrienne can keep track of that as well. So just a few slides first. I just wanted to remind us what we are producing with the GRADEpro software is the summary of findings table. And I'll just go through in a bit more detail in that in a second. But just to let you know that if you haven't already, you can download the GRADEpro software from the IMS site through Cochrane, and that's the website there. But also quite important on that page, we have other resources of the other webinars that we've done. But also important for this session anyway is it's a document that goes through the steps of creating a summary of findings table. So the steps you would go through when you're using the GRADEpro software. Basically, I think we have 12 steps in total, but I really find this summary quite helpful when you're first starting into GRADEpro. Again, the summary of findings table. A lot of times it's a good idea to think of the summary of findings table, yes, as a summary of your findings of your review, but also to think almost of as a table format of your abstract. So any of the results that you felt were important to include in your abstract are likely going to be a lot of the results that you'll be including in your summary of findings table. So one of the double checks we always say is, double check that, if you have something in your abstract and you haven't put it in your summary of findings table, why have you done that? And maybe you do need to include it in your summary of findings table. I'll just see if I can use the pointer to point out. Okay, I think I'm seeing a red dot, so hopefully that's helpful. The main sections of the, great, looks like it can. The main sections of the summary findings table is the top section. So that is basically the PICO of your clinical question. So it's good to set up this area right at the beginning, and I'll show you how to do that, including what your question is and the patients involved in the intervention that you are looking at. Then part of the summary findings table is the main part where for each outcome. You'll notice that there's a row for each outcome, and within each outcome is the description of the outcome, in this case quality of life. Then if I jump forward, you'll have the results under the relative effect. For example, under respiratory-related hospital admissions, it would present the odds ratio or the relative risk or hazards ratio. And then what we do in the summary of findings table specifically is we take that odds ratio or relative risk and convert it into numbers that hopefully most people seem to understand. That what would happen if, say, your patient had a risk of, in this case, being admitted to hospital. If people went to hospital, 10 out of 100 people went to hospital. With the intervention, what would happen? Well, there would be 7 per 100 going to the hospital, so less people. So we take those numbers and convert them into easier numbers for people to understand. Also included and important is the quality of the evidence, so the grade quality, and we'll go in a bit more detail about that. And of course, one of the great things about Cochrane in itself is being transparent about decisions. So you'll notice throughout the table there will be footnotes or comments, and that's a very important part of the summary findings table because it provides the reasons for your judgments and makes it very transparent. So before we start, there's just a couple of things that you really need to think about before you jump into GRADEpro. A lot of times in a systematic review, you may have many comparisons. So, for example, in the self-management review, you could have had self-management compared to usual care. You could have had self-management compared to physical therapy, or self-management even compared to a drug to see what happened to people when they took that self-management program. So, or even when you think of the typical Cochrane systematic review about treatments, you may have had in your comparisons, in your analysis, you may have compared the drug to another drug, or you might have compared the drug to placebo, and you might have compared the drug to different doses. So think about one of the main comparisons that you would like to show in the summary of findings table, because only one summary findings table is presented at the front of the review. However, you can have more than one summary of findings. It's just that they're not presented at the front of the review. They're presented in the table section of the review. So you always want to think about which comparison you'll be highlighting at the front of your review. The other important part is thinking about the outcomes that you'll present in your summary findings table. And as I said before, a lot of times this will be based on the primary outcomes that you identified at the beginning of your review and at the protocol stage. Or they'll just, at the end, when you're thinking about what you want to, you're going through the same thinking when you're thinking about what you'll present in your abstract. Those are likely the primary outcomes that you have decided as a group, in your team has decided, are important for patients or the other decision makers who are reading your review. So it's good to have those primary outcomes pretty much set into your head before you jump into the GRADEpro. Also, you need to have the synthesis part of the review finished in RevMan, because the data is being pulled from your meta-analyses and other parts of the RevMan file, but you need to have those meta-analyses done before importing. You also have to make sure to save the RevMan file to your computer. Now with Archie, a lot of times you're saving it online, but you need to have a file that you can pull into GRADEpro and saved on your computer. And again, making sure to download the GRADEpro software. Okay, so I'll stop now with the presentation part. Were there any questions at this point? Okay, it looks like we're good to go. So what I'll do is hopefully be able to bring up the GRADEpro quite quickly. Okay, and we did have one question, and it was about what to do when you don't have a meta-analysis. And yes, we will show an example of that when creating the summary findings table. A good thing though is to still import your review into GRADEpro, even if you don't have any meta-analyses done, because what will happen is it will bring in the other information, the heading of the table, and help you to build your summary findings table just a bit easier. Okay, so I'll just open GRADEpro for now. So what I've done is I've just opened GRADEpro, and you're given the box right at the beginning, and what we'll just do is open a new profile. And I'll just save it to my desktop. Pretty usual for any program. We'll save that. And I'm left with pretty much an open screen. What I'll do immediately is import the file from your RevMan file into GRADEpro. So I'm just going to go into Import, my Review Manager file, because that's what I'll be importing. And in this case, I've decided to go with a modified RevMan file. So I'm using self-management as my example today. And if you had to go back, it's not the exact file. I've just modified it a bit. So I've clicked on that, and my outcomes have been imported successfully. Okay. And basically what you start to see is if you've been working in RevMan, you'll see that this is how the same idea. Along this left-hand panel, you'll see a breakdown of the comparisons that were actually in your review. In this case, I'll just open this a bit wider for now. In this case, the two comparisons that came out of my meta-analysis was an actual comparison for self-management versus control or usual care. But I also had a comparison for self-management versus written information. And what you can do, similar to RevMan, is just expand that comparison, and then you'll have all of the outcomes underneath that comparison. Again, if I expanded this, all of the outcomes underneath. I'll just close that now. So all of the outcomes, any outcome that had a meta-analysis was pulled in from RevMan. And we'll go back to how to organize those outcomes. But for now, I just wanted to pull in another RevMan file because I wanted to show that a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but sometimes people will not have their review actually organized this way in RevMan. And if that's the case, you can see that this one's organized by comparison and then outcomes, which is generally the way you're supposed to do it. But oftentimes, and I'll just show you, I'll import a different review. This one was a migraine review, and you'll see the difference in a second. Okay, I've imported two, and that's not a problem. What you'll see is that the comparisons in this case they've actually listed it by outcome, not by comparison. So they had the selective serotonin versus another placebo or other drugs, but they've organized it by outcome. If that happens, you just have a bit more fiddling to do to organize the summary of findings table. What I'll do is I'll close this up, and then I can show you later what's happening. Okay, but let's go back into self-management. And this is really good because it is ordered by comparison and then outcome. The next step is that you should be able to view all of the information that was taken in from RevMan files. So what I'll do is I'll actually go into the comparison, and you'll start to see the right-hand panel is where you'll be doing a lot of your work. And all of this information has been pulled in, bibliography, the profile, authors, etc. I just actually have a question. Adrian, are you able to see my pointer when it's moving from field to field? Are you seeing that? Yes, okay, very good. Okay, so what you see here is at the top part where you do your work. On the bottom part is actually your summary findings table starting to be filled in. You can see that top section, and then your individual outcomes and all of the columns. If you've gone into your GRADEpro software, sometimes this shows in a different format, not in the summary findings format. If that happens, you need to go to View, and make sure to click on Summary Findings Table, because the software is also used to make grade profiles for guideline development, but we want to see it in the Summary Findings Table format. So mine is clicked, and then I am seeing it at the below and starting to fill it in. What you might have noticed is that the main title looks pretty good, but there's some mistakes in how this section was pulled in. Doesn't really make sense. The intervention is not self-management versus control. The intervention is actually just the self-management program. So what we need to do is use this section to edit what we have. Typically, you'll be choosing the format as intervention versus comparison for a health problem, or used in a population. It's just so that most times you will have a comparison. So I'm going to choose that, and now I have intervention, comparison, health problem, and the setting. So I just need to clean that up, and I'm just going to put self-management. Clean up, I'm going to put usual care. This part, I don't need the patients with the patient, so it's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because I'm looking at self-management versus usual care for people who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. And my setting, of course, is an outpatient setting. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but I'll just backspace. You can see right here that it's filling in that section, so patient, and it's filling in right here at the bottom. So right now, I've cleaned up this area and entered in everything. We usually recommend, if there's something in particular about your intervention, to put in a footnote. So self-management, in this case, when we were working with the authors, they thought it was important to suggest or to point out that the self-management programs were primarily done with one-on-one as opposed to group self-management programs. So if that's something you want to make clear, we always recommend you can put in a footnote, and these are what these tags are across. This gives you the opportunity to add in a footnote if you want to. So I'll just give an example of the footnote, and most of these programs were individual sessions as a note, or in another program. So yes, save it, please save it. And if you look at the bottom, here's the footnote coming up. If you look at the bottom, here's the footnotes that will be included in your summary of findings table. So just where it says footnotes. Okay. Basically, our top section looks pretty good, and we're ready to move on to the rest of the summary of findings table. One of the main things typical with an interface, you'll generally have all of your file buttons at the top. One of the buttons that we find quite useful is to be able to preview the summary of findings table. So just at the top on the right-hand corner, I find it helpful after you've imported and started working on it to click on Preview SOF Table, because you'll begin to see what it's starting to look at and be able to really identify the areas where you need to clean up the data. So I'll just click on Preview Summary Findings Table. I want to see the Summary Findings Table, so you have those choices, these three choices here. And I'm looking at the self-management versus usual care. So if I just slide down a bit, I can see that my title's looking quite good. But I have all of these outcomes down the left-hand side. A few too many outcomes, maybe outcomes that I didn't want included. There's actually an outcome that I wanted to include, but I didn't have a meta-analysis for it. So I'm going to have to add that in because it's important. Just some of the numbers are looking a little bit funny. I'd like to clean that up as well. Okay, and obviously I'll probably be putting in a few more footnotes as well. Okay, so I'll just close that for now. And so the next step at this point is organizing the outcomes. So we saw that we had a few too many and we didn't actually have the ones that we wanted in our summary findings table. I'll just open this up a little bit more so we can see it a bit better. Now, in conversations between the authors, they had decided that it was important to include quality of life, which is this HRQOL. They will want to include the total quality of life, but they didn't want to include the quality of life subscale of symptoms. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on that, right-click on that, and delete the outcome. And it's always nice to be reminded, because once you delete it, it's gone. I do want to have the score of breathing difficulties. I don't want the one about antibiotics because there's a lot of controversy about how that's measured, so I'm going to delete that one. Respiratory hospital admissions, yes, I want that one. I would like to keep the next two. And lung function, which is really a surrogate outcome and not very important to patients to see what their percent volume is. And I'm going to delete that one as well. At this stage now, I can see that I'm missing an outcome because it's very important in COPD with any treatment to understand, to see what happens to the number of exacerbations, so when it becomes an acute problem for patients. And so I'd like to add in an outcome. So I can do it in a couple of ways. I can either click along the top and add an outcome, or I can simply right-click and add an outcome. It automatically goes to the bottom, and just to let you know, on this side of the screen, on the right-hand side, I've just gone over, I do have to enter the name of that outcome, and for this one, I'll just put in number of exacerbations. So I can easily just type that in, and we'll go back to that. So I've added that one in. I actually would like to move it up closer to the top because it is an important outcome that I think should be highlighted at the top in the summary of findings table. So I'm just going to drag and drop that, and I'm going to put it after the score for breathing difficulties and symptoms. So I've just dragged and dropped it and moved it. So that was quite easy. Okay, so I do have my outcomes organized at this point. So what we can do what I'll do is I'll just go into one of the outcomes, and let's start with respiratory-related hospital admission. And you can just click on that, and I'll just shrink this for us for now. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, again, the top part is your working area. And for now, you can see along the bottom what's been just simply imported from the RevMan file. So we did have a meta-analysis for this. The odds ratio was 0.64. And it's already added in the number of studies and the number of patients taken right from your meta-analysis. So what I'll do is I'll just confirm that, do I like the title of this outcome? I'm happy with this title, but if I didn't, I could back up and add in some different words, but I'm happy with the title that it will be showing in the summary of findings table. It is a dichotomous outcome, and it has been pooled. And well, we'll go back to that probably. There were 8 studies that were pooled, and they were randomized controlled trials. So you'll always need to choose this just in case. So in this screen, we have the quality of evidence. So this screen is all about the quality of the evidence. And this is the GRADE system. It uses the GRADE approach to be able to go through the quality of the evidence. What I'd like to do is just go forward and work on the numbers first. I always find it helpful to look at the numbers before deciding on the level of evidence. So what I will do is just go over to the right-hand side, and I'm going to go to the summary of findings screen. So here you'll see all of the information that has been pulled in from the meta-analysis and also a few calculations that have been done. If I wanted to go back to the quality assessment screen, I would just simply click on this. But right now we're working on the summary of findings, so the actual numbers that will show up in the screen. one of the first things I think we should do is maybe go through step by step what we have here. What we have from the meta-analysis is that the odds ratio is 0.64. It's given the confidence intervals. There were actually 95 people, according to the intervention, 95 people out of 528 in the intervention groups from all of those 8 studies. And if you picture a meta-analysis, it's really just taken right out of there. GRADEpro has calculated the percent, so just an average percent of people who had an admission, and it's also done that again for the control event rate. So it's taken the 112 people out of 438, and this again, right here along the side on the right-hand side, is only an average. So the 112 divided by 438. So an average rate of admissions in the control group, the ones who had just the usual care. What GRADEpro has done is also provided the range of control risks in the individual studies. So that's just highlighted. So from all of the studies, there was one study where 8 out of 100, if it was put into 100% into percents, 8% of the people in one of the studies had admissions to hospital in the control group. There was another study at the high end where there was actually approximately 50% or 51% of the people who had an admission to the hospital. So these are just taking these average rates right from the studies that were included in the meta-analysis. GRADEpro has also calculated a median percentage. So not the average as shown at the 25.6, but the median. So median is actually median and calculated it for you. The great thing about this is because part of the summary findings table is you need to decide on presenting what has happened, what's the usual occurrence or event rate in people who did not have the self-management program. So we're filling in this first column. So how many people do you want to present that had admissions in the control group or in an average population? So basically your baseline risk. And there's a couple of ways that you can decide on these risks. You can either take an average, you can take the median risk, you can present a range, so low risk group and a high risk group. You can get the information from perhaps there's been some observational studies done where they followed patients and found that what percent of people usually have are admitted to hospital per year, that's usually there's about 3 ways that you can do that. So it's up to you as an author to decide what you will present. In conversations with the author, we decided that since there's such a broad range of admissions between studies, that this likely represented probably some low-risk patients and some high-risk patients. So we decided that let's use the low and high averages from the study. So what we did is we unclicked median because we didn't want to present the median risk, and we also but we did want to present the low risk, and we just averaged that out to an amount of 10, just so it was easier for the user, and the high risk, and we put in 50 as 50%, and we did not use the average risk. So as you did notice, GRADEpro automatically inserted an average or a median, but you have to decide as an author which one you are going to present. In this case, we wanted to present the broad range. So we have the low risk and the high risk group. Once we clicked that, I wasn't sure if you noticed, but it did change down here. So we have 10% or 100 out of 1,000, and we have the 500 per 1,000. We thought that it was a bit we didn't need to be very specific about per 1,000 as we did round off the numbers, and so we just provided it in 100. So you have that option of, depending on your risks, whether you present it in 1,000 or in 100 or even 1,000,000. Okay, so we've worked on presenting our baseline amounts, and GRADEpro has automatically calculated the event rate in people who had self-management or taken a self-management program. So 10 out of 100 people in the average population would have an admission to the hospital if they didn't take self-management program, but 7 per 100 would be admitted to hospital if they took the program. And that was calculated basically taking the odds ratio, some calculations, converting it to a relative risk, and then just timesing the 7 or the 10 times the odds ratio and came up with 7. Maybe any questions about that part right now before I go ahead? I'll just release the microphone just in case someone has a question, or you can again raise your hand. Looks like we didn't have any questions, so I'll just continue. The other parts of the outcome is it's looking still a bit empty. One of the main concerns is making sure to describe your outcome. So on this page, we also can describe the outcome. Very important, especially for hospital-related admissions, is when this was actually measured. So I'll fill in the length of follow-up, and I'm going to provide a range. You can also provide a mean for the length of follow-up. A lot of times it seems that range is one of the most ones often used. The range in these studies was from 3 to 12 months. Oops, 12 months. So I'm just typing that in. And then here, I can choose months, days, weeks, etc. So I'll just put in months. And if you can see that filled in just along the on the left-hand side of the summary findings table, saying that the follow-up was 3 to 12 months. So I think we've finished with that part of the section. So what we can do is go back to the quality assessment part. Now, we had a separate webinar actually by Holger Schunemann last month, who went through the specifics of how to grade your outcomes using the GRADE approach. And so I won't go into the specific details about that. We are creating also online modules, but I will show you how to work through this and how to get some help while you're working on it as well. In this case, for the respiratory-related hospital admissions, there was a lot of discussion with the authors about what was the main concern, whether we could really be confident in the result. Was the odds ratio of 0.64 the true result, and were we confident that it was the true result? We decided that there was some issues with whether the studies that contributed to the meta-analysis were actually representative, included representative populations, and they decided that 2 of the studies which heavily weighed into the meta-analysis had very severe COPD patients. So they weren't sure if it would, this odds ratio was generalizable really to patients who did not have very severe COPD. So that really goes under the issue of indirectness. So they really thought that limitations in design, all the risk of bias for those studies, there were no serious limitations in that design. They didn't have very much heterogeneity, so no. But they felt that there might be some concern about the generalizability to patients who did not have severe COPD. So they decided that the quality of the evidence would likely be downgraded for indirectness. So they didn't think it was very serious, but it was serious enough to downgrade. Once you choose that serious, because you've downgraded the evidence, and we want to make sure we're being transparent, we did have to enter a footnote. So I'll just enter that. I do want to add a new footnote because it's not this one. I'll add a new footnote and say, just briefly, severe patients included in meta-analysis may not be applicable to people with mild COPD. Oops, sorry, accidentally clicked. I could go back. I could, actually that's good. I want to edit the footnote, so I'll click on it and just edit it, and I'll finish typing. COPD. Okay, and I'll save that and make sure to click it because that's the footnote that I want attached to that TAC. And again, there's my footnote, and if you look behind, at the bottom, there's my footnote as well there. Imprecision, or the tightness around the confidence intervals, we didn't really have a problem with that, so no. And publication bias, we didn't see that there was any publication bias, so we clicked that it was unlikely. And if you'll notice right now, in the summary of findings table, it has filled in the quality of evidence. So it took your downgrade for indirectness and made it a moderate level of evidence. Now, if you do need more information about those specific criteria for the level of evidence, you can roll over them, and what you'll have is a direct link to the help section. So I'll just do that now and hope that it works on this. There it's can people see that? That's the help file. Yeah, I see some smiley faces. This is the help file. I specifically had clicked on publication bias, and so the help file is quite extensive. So if I can go into any of the sections. I'll just shrink that. You can go to the help at any point in the GRADEpro. There's a help button, but you can also just roll over certain fields and just get more information about that. And I'll just blow up while we're here the creating summary of findings table section. And if you'll see, there's a section for completing quality, so your levels of evidence. And you'll see that it goes through all of the criteria, rating and precision. You can go into more of a detailed description of it, people writing systematic reviews. So there's quite a bit of information there. And also it goes into, we'll just shrink this along the side. It'll also go into how to complete those numbers for the summary of findings tables, specifically for dichotomous outcomes or continuous outcomes. So that's always available. And I'll just close that for now. Are we back? Adrian, if you can just let me know, are we back to the main page? Is everyone seeing that? Great. Okay, perfect. So you always have help available. So if we look at this outcome, it's pretty much done. It is done. I'm very happy with it. I like what I'm seeing here. I think what we'll do is we'll go into another outcome, and this one will be a continuous outcome. So I'll just go into the dyspnea outcome. And perhaps this really isn't a good name because it might be confusing to people. So you could change the name of it as severity of symptoms. So I've just typed that in, and you can see that it changed along the left-hand side. So it's now called severity of symptoms. It is a continuous outcome. There were 2 studies that provided information. They were randomized controlled trials. This would be typical of how we did in the other outcome, but I'll just jump ahead because the summary of findings section is a bit different for continuous variables, continuous outcomes. So at this point, you'll notice that because it's a continuous outcome and you're basically working on scores of all of the people that were in the studies, you'll see that there were 66 people in the intervention group and who had the self-management, and 78 people in total from the people who had usual care. So that, again, has been pulled from the meta-analysis. We had the mean difference come in, 0.53 or minus 0.53, and the confidence intervals are also there. The difficulties often with scores or continuous outcomes are it's difficult to interpret the scales. So we highly recommend that people put in some information about that scale. So the scale that was used was the Borg, if I can spell this properly, scale that was used. So I'll type that in, and you can see that it shows up at the bottom here on the left-hand side. The range of possible scores for that scale. This is all important information because it helps people to understand what the score, what a mean difference actually means. So in this case, the scale is actually from 0 to 10. So we found in the mean difference that when people had self-management programs, that their score actually went down 0.53 units on that scale. So it just helps to put that in a bit more of a context for people reading this. And you can see here that it says the severity of the symptoms was 0.53 points lower, and that's in the group that had the self-management program. Now we have to fill this empty box. Okay, well that's what happened in people who had the self-management program, but what was the actual score to begin with in the people who had the who didn't have anything at all? So what does 0.53 actually mean? Did they start out at 1, and so 0.53 difference was actually quite a big difference, or did they start out at 8, and so 0.53 may not be really that much of a difference? And that's the type of information that patients would want to see, that physicians and clinicians would want to see as well. So the place to fill that in is in this section here, the final value or change score in controls. In this case, this is pulled from the meta-analysis, and what you'll need to do in the meta-analysis, you'll just be looking at the control group column in the meta-analysis, and you'll see what the scores actually were. In this case, the scores were, I'm just going to put again the range, which is usually what we tend to put in. The score actually was from 1 to 4 points in people who had usual care. At the end of the study, this was their score. There's no units for the dyspnea scale, the board scale. But in some cases, if you were measuring length of stay in the hospital, you would probably have, say a range from 1 to 4, and you could type in days. I just did a review where we did weight, and so in that case, I just put in kilograms. And as you can see, it just fills in down here. So the people had 1 to 4 was their weight or whatever, or change in weight. It was 1 to 4 kilograms. So that's just helpful. So I'll just delete that because there were no units for this scale. Other information that's important, again, was the length of follow-up. In this case, the studies that contributed to this outcome were only 2 studies, and the length of follow-up was, again, the range. It was from 3 to 6, and it was months. So basically, I've just filled in a bit more information to help people understand this outcome a bit better and be able to understand those numbers and what they mean. The relative risk, if I just move this up a bit, you can see that for the board scale, there is no relative effect because there was a mean difference. So we haven't anything filled in there. And again, we'll go back, and we would then fill in this section here. I'll just do that quite quickly. Again, you can add footnotes, downgrade however you like. And again, you'll see that now the high has been filled in at the side. So as was asked before, another scenario, you have your dichotomous and your continuous, is you may actually have an outcome, for example, our number of exacerbations, where there was no meta-analysis. So I've just clicked on that outcome, number of exacerbations. As you recall, we added in that outcome, so we didn't have any data pulled in from the RevMan file. It is a dichotomous outcome, but it wasn't pooled. So because it's not pooled, we also are given a chance to add in different how it was measured. Sometimes you may have a systematic review where a lot of times quality of life isn't measured, and that's important to patients, and you might want to include that as an important outcome in your table. If it wasn't measured, then you have the option of adding it in and just saying that it wasn't measured or not reported, and it will automatically fill in the table that there was nothing available for that outcome. In our case, we have a number of exacerbations and it wasn't pooled, but it was actually reported in the studies, and there were 3 studies that reported it. So I'll just enter in the number of studies, and again choose that it was randomized controlled trials. I can again assess the quality of the evidence for those 3 studies, but I won't have a meta-analysis. But I would like to put in some information about that. I'll go to the summary findings table. And there were actually, I can still enter that there were, you know, maybe 50 people in the intervention group, and there were 100 people in the control group. And I just added the 50 and the 100. And just to let you know, if we look down at the bottom, I haven't clicked it there. Okay, there was 50 people, there was 100 people, and if we look at the bottom of the screen, number of exacerbations, if everyone can follow, it has filled in that there were 3 studies, and it has filled in that there were 150 people. If I want to, again, I can fill in the length of follow-up, etc., for those 3 studies. But at this point, I want to communicate from those 3 studies, even though I couldn't pool them, what were some of the results from those 3 studies. To be able to enter that, I would suggest filling it into the comments section. The comments section is a bit different. You can just click on the comments and enter in whatever you want. You know, 2 of 3 studies were non-significant changes, and write in whatever you like, and again, save. So again, the comment section, if you ever want to add anything in, you can just click directly on the comment section and add in your comments. So I hope that's answered the question about the number of exacerbations when you don't have a meta-analysis done. You can still enter the information, and that's very helpful for users to see that. So right now we're pretty much, you would work through all of the outcomes at this stage, and then you're thinking that you're pretty much finished. Before you take what you've done in here and import it back into the RevMan file, it's always a good idea to preview your summary findings table. Again, we'll go back to that section, again clicking on the top right-hand side to see what it looks like. I find this view here is very helpful while I'm working on it, but I really can't see any errors that I've made until I actually really look at what it's going to look like at the end. So I always recommend previewing the table before. And again, I'm looking at the self-management usual care. I'm looking at a summary of findings table, and I'll just scroll through here. We haven't filled in anything, but at this point you can usually see, just because it's in a better format, you can usually see if you've made any errors or forgot to fill anything in. So I find that really helpful. So I'll just close that. You've decided that you're ready to go. You have your summary of findings table done. So at this point, you just will have to export the file. So what I'll do is I'll file, and I'm going to export as a review manager summary findings table. So I'll just click on that, and I'll just save it to my desktop as the self-management summary of findings. You can see that it'll be saved as a special file which can be imported into RevMan. So I'll save that. And basically you're done with GRADEpro. So before we leave GRADEpro, are there any questions? Just raise your hand and I'll just release the audio for a minute or so just to see if there's any quick questions before we actually, because we'll just be leaving the software now. Okay, it looks like we're okay. So what I'll do is hopefully get back to where I need to be. I'm just going to minimize the screen. And I just want to make sure that people are seeing the presentation. If anyone can just give a smiley face. Excellent. Okay, so we're back to the presentation. Instead of opening RevMan, because I was a bit concerned about whether I could open too many programs at one time, what I've done is I've just done some slides about how you would now import that summary of findings table back into the RevMan file of your systematic review. So I'll just skip ahead. So this will just be about adding your summary findings table into RevMan. So if you're in your RevMan file, this is the self-management file. Basically you're looking at along the side, along the tables, section along the side. So you've blown up tables, and you can see that it shows right here the summary of findings table as an option. So you'll need to click on that summary of findings table. And once you do, you'll see that you now have the spot in the RevMan file here. And you just basically click on the Add Summary Findings table, and you'll be given a wizard in RevMan for importing your table. It's not very clear, so I'll just read off. The top one is importing your table from a grade profile file, which is what we have. So you just go through it, click Next. You simply look for your summary of findings table that you presently saved from GRADEpro. I've highlighted that. I'm going to open it then. It'll basically pull in that summary of findings table, so we can just see the top part of the summary of findings table. And that's the one we want to add in. And you're basically just then clicking Finish. And your summary of findings table has been entered into RevMan. So this was the table that we worked on, and that's been imported into RevMan. So quite easy. The only concern is that if you redo an analysis after editorial review, you will have to delete this summary of findings table, make your changes in your GRADEpro software to whatever, if you needed to change something, save it again, and then re-import it back in. So you won't be able to, once you've imported the summary findings table, you won't be able to go back into it and make any edits. So it's, you can only make the edits in GRADEpro and import it in. But the import feature is quite simple, and the wizard will help you move through those sections quite easily. I think that that was all I had. If you do need help, I'm always available, and that's my email address. That's part of my role, is helping people make their summary of findings table, so we're always happy to help. That's what we're supposed to be doing. You can also reach me and others at support@gradepro.org, and we'll try and respond to your questions as quickly as possible. As I noted before, that we are currently creating some online modules about more help with grade in particular, and creating summary of findings tables and what decisions you need to make. And also, because of the work that we've been doing with the Canadian Centre, we do have other webinars posted, and this one of course will be posted probably in the next few hours. And you can also see on that website other introduction to summary findings tables and more detail about grade. I'm just looking at a question that came in, and it was just a question specifically about downgrading and upgrading the grade criteria. And perhaps it's a bit, I went through that a bit quickly because I didn't want to go into too much detail about the specific criteria. In general, one of the criteria that I focused on was the indirectness, and if the odds ratio was applicable to people with severe COPD. And because the studies were primarily heavily weighted in severe COPD, we wondered about whether we could generalize that odds ratio, those results, to people without severe COPD. The authors were quite concerned about that when they were doing the review, and so didn't feel comfortable saying that they were very confident in the result, the odds ratio for people who did not have severe COPD. So they decided that it would be good to downgrade, and you know, sometimes there may be some discussion within the authors, and what is always good is that whether you decide to downgrade or not, it's always good to include that footnote, so it is transparent and others can make that judgment as well. I just had another question about GRADEpro being available for Mac users. We're still working on that, and we're also having some hopes about how we might be able to incorporate GRADEpro better into RevMan as well. So we're moving forward, recognizing that that GRADEpro is a separate software from RevMan, and what's the best way that people can work on those. So yes, we're working on the Mac availability as well. But of course, if you're working on Mac and have the Windows or the operating system already on Mac, then it's not a problem using GRADEpro. But we are working on the Mac version as well. Any other questions at all? And thank you very much for your attention and for your questions as well.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And yes, I agree with the applause that is coming through the room. Thank you. That was a wonderful demonstration. So what I want to do at this time is thank you for joining us. You've been great. Thank you for bringing your questions to the chat room. Thank you to Nancy for your demonstration, for fielding the questions. If you would just take a moment, I am going to send you an evaluation form. If you could give us feedback on today's session, give us ideas for future sessions, that would be great. It'll just take a moment for this to come through, and you should be able to download and save it on your computer. It is a readable Adobe PDF file, so even if you're just using Adobe Reader, we've extended the privileges on the form so that you should be able to type in, save it to your computer, and we ask that you email it back to us at ccnc-iph@uottawa.ca. And one thing I didn't mention is our spring series is soon to be released, so stay tuned, and we will send it through our regular email channels as well as putting it up on our website. And I just want to thank you for joining us today. Have a great day, and we look forward to your participation in the spring series.